Hey, bro. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Yeah, no worries. He must be exhausted or still trying to adjust to being back or what.
No, it's the same time zone. So we flew. It was pretty cool actually. You can fly direct flight to Punta Cana from Atlanta, and yeah, we just arrived at the airport, drove to the hotel, and then didn't leave for a week. And it was great because there's like SpongeBob characters and water slides and shit. So he was fully entertained, and me and the missus just laid around, sunbathed, cocktails, good food, and but it was frustrating in a sense that in an exotic place and then in a really very artificial environment when I was there. So I was just reading about the history of the Dominican Republic while I was staying there, and dude, it's so fascinating. It shares an island with Haiti. Haiti's on the west, and the Dominican Republic is the rest of the island. And yeah, they've just had so much violence and gore and colonial shit throughout pretty much their entire existence. But now they're doing pretty well, at least comparatively to Haiti. So anyway, I want to go back and then maybe not stay at a Nickelodeon resort.
Well, I would say all the blood and violence was worth it because there's a Nickelodeon resort. I mean, that's kind of what it all builds up to, is it not?
Hey, if you want Patrick and SpongeBob, you gotta break a few pineapples. That's what I say.
You gotta break a few pineapples. It's all worth it in the end, I think. But that is one of those things that I always try to wrap my mind around, because I've never been anywhere really tropical or a destination like the Dominican Republic or Jamaica, countries which are, pretty poor in like a really dire way, but are also incredibly famous for tourism and having pristine beaches. And that's something I always have a hard time wrapping my brain around.
Yeah, it's weird. I think you have guilt when you go in as a tourist because you're like, well, there's a reason this resort is in I'm not sure if it's third world, but like a country where your dollar goes really far because you can, there was 1 million people working there, and I'm assuming the food and everything is cheaper there. And you're like, well, I'm cashing in on this, I guess, dollar arbitrage that's happening. But then you're also like, well, if I wasn't here, they'd be even more screwed. So yeah, it's like a strange, because yeah, I think that tourism does prop up a lot of those economies. So I don't know. It's definitely a minefield of privilege. But then you're like, well, if you're living in the first world, you're privileged anyway. But if you just live in a first world city, unless you go to the worst parts of it, you are in a cocoon. When you go on a vacation, you're confronted with your privilege right in front of your face. You have to be like, well, this is who you are. Are you going to embrace it or change the world? And
right.
most people sit in the middle of those two. But when you're on vacation, you have to embrace it, I guess. How about you? How have you been? You were sick, right?
What's that?
You were sick like a week and a half ago.
This is just my natural state of being recently. Yeah, I was under the weather recently. I think I'm technically better, but I don't feel, quote unquote good. So I think this is just what I get to look forward to. But recently I had a conversation with an older gentleman, I guess I'll call him, that's pretty relevant to our topic today. I was at a bar, and this Japanese guy who was almost 80 but spoke really, really good English started chatting me up. And he seemed like a pretty chatting to me. He seemed like an interesting dude. So I was like, yeah, well, I'll talk to him. His English is great. And for a guy who's pushing 80, he still had all his faculties about him and whatnot. And he started talking about all the places he's traveled to and how he likes meeting people of different backgrounds and how he gets on with just about everyone. And I'm thinking, oh, great, that's good. And then there's a pause, and he says, well, except for fucking Koreans. And I go, oh, well, why is that then? And it's one of those things where I know I shouldn't, But whenever I hear people say things like that, I like to egg them on, not because I agree. I just want to see what more they're going to say. Is there a limit, or do they feel emboldened to keep going? And he goes, there's whenever there's bad service in this country or people who are terrible at their jobs, it's always fucking Koreans, and they're just a bunch of liars. And I said, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by liars? He goes, oh, they're always talking about how in the Second World War the Japanese enslaved the women and forced them into prostitution. That never happened. I'm like, oh, that never happened. He's like, no, there's no evidence that that ever happened. And it's one of those things where you hear that certain countries aren't taught about their history, or they're ignorant to certain aspects about their history, but you don't know how true that is until you actually meet someone like this guy. And I've heard, like, time and time again, that Japan just isn't taught the Second World War at all, to the point that the general population knows very little about it. And that's not something I could prove, because other than this guy and things I've seen online, this isn't a conversation that really comes up. I'm not just going around asking people like, hey, like, what do you think about the Bataan Death March? Or what do you think about, like, prostitution, like enforced prostitution? I don't have these conversations. But I've seen enough sources to tell me that Japan's knowledge of their own role in the Second World War is almost non-existent. And I am sort of inclined to believe that. And on the flip side of that, I've heard that in Germany, when kids learn about the Second World War, it's like kind of beaten into them how terrible they were, in order to remind them, like, hey, let's not let this happen again. Like, we lost for a reason. Like, this is what brainwashing and propaganda did to us. It led us to 2 world wars and terrible results. Like, learn from our mistakes. Whereas Japan doesn't. They never reconciled with that. So I don't know, what thoughts or things do you know or like feel about this, if any?
Well, yeah, I when I was reading through the articles that you sent through, it reminded me of a conversation that I had with one of my history teachers when I was in high school. We were studying the Second World War, and I asked the guy, I was like, well, Australia, part of the Allied forces, we were at war with Japan and Germany, and they killed a lot of Australians. And I didn't really feel this, but I kind of threw it out to him. I was like, why shouldn't we still hate the Japanese and Germans for what they did? And because, yeah, I was just, like the whole, the weird dance of education and propaganda that happens during the we just get drilled over our heads in Australia, the Anzac Spirit, which was a World War I event where the Australian forces arrived in the beaches of Turkey, and we got decimated at Gallipoli, and there was this long campaign, but we were basically screwed from the outset. So we get told over and over again about how brave these Australians were and the big fight that they put up along with the Kiwis that were in the trenches with us. But you never get taught the Turks were the ones blasting us with machine guns, and they slaughtered a lot of our guys. So I threw it out to the history teacher, and I always remember his response. He was like, I can understand a someone who experienced those atrocities or was a part of the wars, either directly or indirectly through family members, to hold a grudge and continue to hate those people to this day, or those nations to this day. But if you're a couple generations later and you're hanging on to that, then you're kind of stuck in the part. Like, it doesn't make sense for you to continue. So, yeah, I was, because, yeah, I think when I was a kid, I remember when I first started hearing about what the Germans and the Japanese did, I was kind of, my visceral reaction was kind of like, those douchebags. I can't believe they would do that. And then you read a bit more about history and you kind of like, well, that's war, right? The things are happening on both sides. But then I guess this particular story, it does make you kind of question what goes beyond the pale in respect to stuff you're allowed to do. and especially when they're dead, but they're dead already. Should you be able to have a little snack if you're if you're a gym junkie, you're fighting a war, but you also have a very strict workout regimen, and it's hard to get protein when you're in Papua New Guinea to maintain your 8-pack. What should you do? But anyway, why don't you kind of give us the main bullet points of the story to kind of talk about, and then we'll discuss more.
I mean, I know this is going to sound far-fetched, considering how like done to death World War II is as a genre, whether it's film, television, miniseries, or video games. But there's still so many insane stories that have not been told, which would make really, really compelling. I think in this case, a horror movie, like a straight up horror movie, because that's what it is. And I think the Pacific theater in particular is so neglected compared to the European theater of war. And I mean, the Nazis are just the definitive bad guys, and they always will be. Like the German language, the way they look, their ideology, their symbols, their uniforms, they are the bad guys. Which is weird that Japan kind of gets a pass because, I mean, how do you compare atrocities? Like at a certain point, what number do you make a distinction or a cutoff? It's like, well, these guys killed 500,000 and those guys only killed 60,000. Like, I mean, do you really make that distinction? I mean, to me, it's the same. I don't know. I don't really know how to qualify these kind of things. But in my mind, the Imperial Japanese Army was just as bad as Nazi Germany. There's a reason they were allies. They had very similar mentalities. But Japan is even harder for me to put my finger on some of the things they did and their complete unwillingness to surrender. The Germans, they were monsters, but they still, for lack of a better term, they still had some semblance of humanity. They would take prisoners, I mean, depending on what country they're from, and they would treat them somewhat decently. And they respected some of the rules of war, whereas the Japanese did none of that. So throughout history, I don't know if there's ever been such a fanatical enemy, especially in the 20th century. It's just so hard to wrap your mind around an enemy that brutally kills prisoners, that kills the civilian population without like blinking an eye, that doesn't surrender. So in order to beat them, you literally have to annihilate them. There's no if, and, or buts. And so on top of all that, imagine they start eating your buddies. Jesus Christ. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah, so the article that you sent that was essentially about the Pacific campaign theater of war, is that what they call it, in World War II, and the Japanese were on relatively remote islands in Papua New Guinea, and then when the Allied forces were like reclaiming those territories, right, that they were finding evidence. There's that horrific passage where they kind of stumble upon a Japanese camp and they find like human remains actually on the stove. And and just kind of skulls and stuff lying around, human remains. And then from there, that was interesting, that old crazy coot Japanese guy where the documentary was about, which sounds like a good documentary. I want to try and find that on YouTube. This Japanese guy did his own kind of investigative reporting and was kind of going on about how the Japanese were cannibals. So many of the army dudes were cannibals during World War II, and took it upon himself to investigate and name and shame. And it sounded like a one-man campaign because, like you were saying, they have their collective heads in the sand regarding their role and exactly what they did during World War II. So, but yeah, some of the stories were pretty harrowing. And I tend to agree with what you said in terms of Japan's role mirroring Germany. And I think that like one thing that my perspective has definitely shifted on. And I think, again, this is because when World War II was rammed down my throat as a teenager, you have kind of a childlike mentality, you simplify things, and Hitler is personified as Satan, and you assume that, like, in the battle of good and evil, Satan wants to take over the world. You kind of learn a little bit more about the Nazi ideology and the Third Reich. He wanted Europe, essentially, like that, and as much as Russia as he could get his hands on, the kind of European parts of Russia is what he was after, really. And I think this is kind of explored a little bit in that Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle. I didn't watch all of that. I haven't read the book. I didn't watch the whole series, but kind of talks a little bit about, like, Hitler would have wanted this, and then just probably the spoils of war, there would have been like colonial outposts in America or other parts of the world that would have been divvied up. But I think Japan perhaps had an even more fanatical, the emperor is God, he deserves everything type of mentality. So you could argue that the Japanese, once if the war had gone the other way, they might have claimed Asia, and then beyond there, they would have been more hell-bent on taking everything due to their kind of like more advanced kind of cult of worship with their emperor, and probably their kind of understanding that they deserve the entire world. So maybe that tied into why they were more ruthless and saw everyone else as subhuman, because they were just like, well, you're not Japanese, we deserve everything here.
Well, what's so interesting about Japan's case is they kind of caught on to colonialism much later than their European counterparts, but they made up for lost time. They really, really got into it. And one of their justifications for taking Asian lands were, well, look, isn't it better that fellow Asians are your colonial overlords, and like we break that European white monopoly? And, you know, there's an argument to be had there. However, it's hard to have a lot of fans when the moment you take over, you start beheading the local populace for not bowing low enough. Like, you know, you're replacing one dickhead with an equal or bigger dickhead. And in Japan's case, the emperor is literally a living embodiment of God. And I don't know how, like, to prove how much they actually believe that, but apparently enough to do the things they did. And I think another reason the European theater of war just comes off as more romantic, I guess. Everyone's able to visualize Paris or Italy or like some flat fields in the Netherlands, whereas so much of the Pacific War took place in islands that no one's ever heard of. But that's also what makes it all the more interesting, because these islands were just as weird for the Japanese as they were for the Americans or the Australians. It's not like we were fighting the Japanese on their own familiar territory. We're fighting in some godforsaken jungle that is just as scary to them as it is to the Allied soldiers. You know, a man-eating crocodile isn't less scary to a Japanese soldier, and neither are giant centipedes or terrible rainstorms and swamps and all this shit. So you got people thousands of miles from home on either side in the absolute most hellish conditions. And in the story we're talking about today, specifically in Papua New Guinea, which to me is one of the most fascinating places on earth. I'm continuously shocked that this place exists. I think something like 80% of it is still unexplored because the terrain is just that bad, and so many tribes have not been contacted, have never had any exposure to the civilized world. And this is one of the few places on earth where, you know, in line with this story, some of the tribes are active cannibals. And what a crazy place. And the fact that there's going to be a years-long campaign between Japanese and, in this case, Australian soldiers, because this story concerns Australian guys. And so you're already in the worst place on earth, and your enemy doesn't take prisoners. Or they do, but you're probably not going to survive. And in this case, they're going to fucking eat you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, reading the articles that you sent over did force me to confront my perspective about cannibalism. And I'm not sure if this is because I'm a straight up and down materialist, but I kind of don't. If I died, I couldn't really give a shit if someone ate me. Like, I guess I put the equivalency that I found was when I had to get a new driver's license over here recently. Do you want to be an organ donor? Yes. So what's the difference of my organs getting chopped up and put into another a child or some alcoholic that needs, God forbid if he gets my liver, but if he needs other parts of me, that's fine. But if someone took those same organs and made a nice kind of I don't know, stew with it, what's the difference here? So it'd be interesting to dig into whether there is some type of like evolutionary reason why cannibalism is such a taboo, frightening subject, whether, the whole, I don't know, something to do with like akin to incest or something, where in the past people who've done that have screwed themselves over royally with inbreeding, and the same with cannibalism. Maybe like people ate bad meat 100,000 years ago because their mate Larry died, Larry the caveman, and then they killed over because they got an infection or some some type of bug a couple days later from Larry's ankle. So perhaps there's a reason there, but now, where it's like if I keeled over and I was still good, put on ice pretty quickly. I'm assuming my family wouldn't want to eat me, but we need protein, man. Like, there's 7 billion people in the world. There's a chicken holocaust that happens every day because everyone loves chicken across cultures pretty much. And so I'm looking forward in terms of the Matrix existence, where we're all going to be just in little kind of tubs and we need our sustenance. Maybe this is maybe we're going to have to start getting on, if beyond meat or Impossible Burgers doesn't work, which it looks like it doesn't, filled with oil and the pea protein isn't good for you or whatever. Maybe we're going to have to get on board and have a little snack time with ourselves. So how do you feel about cannibalism as a broad topic?
Well, there's an episode of It's Always Sunny where Frank says, when I die, just throw my body in the trash. I'm dead. It doesn't fucking matter what you do. And I'm right there with you. I'm an organ donor as well because I'm dead. I don't give a shit. So about cannibalism, I think consuming the flesh of anything is inherently weird. And despite the fact that I eat meat, I'm not one of those people who freaks out when I find out someone's a vegan, because to me, being a vegan, it's not someone doing it just to be annoying. I think eating flesh is weird. And, the more we evolve as a society and understand our own biology and our own needs, we really don't eat meat. I haven't found a Beyond replacement yet that tastes as good, which is why I eat meat. But the moment I do, I have no problem abandoning meat. So I think meat in general is a very weird and pretty savage, unjustifiable thing. I'm not going to stop eating it because I like it.
I love it when meathead bros justify the necessity to eat lean meat, where they're like, but right. dude, like, yeah, try and exist on a vegan diet or vegetarian diet. You won't be able to maintain peak performance. And it's like, dude, well, what does your peak performance look like? Sure, your body looks good, but you run an online gym consulting business with an average of 1.5 clients per month for the last 2 years, and you don't know how to talk to women in public. So if this is what peak performance looks like, I think that you could maybe scale back and survive on some lentils for a while. So I always think that's interesting. Someone like a UFC fighter, Cristiano Ronaldo, those guys where it's like, yeah, sure, if they're going to get 5% extra speed or mental agility to perform at the highest level, go for it. You can the ends justify the means, but for the rest of us, where we're just slobbing around trying to overcome our personality flaws and con one another to convince each other that we're cool people, I think we can get by on vegan, vegetarian food, but we choose not to because we're conditioned to love meat, and it's simple and it's part of the culture and all that. So I tend to agree. I eat meat, but I also, if someone today knocked on my door and said, yeah, we've done the results are in, it's animals feel pain, factory farming is evil, it's now outlawed, I'd be like, well, we had a good run, now I'm a vegetarian or I'm a vegan, whatever the government's mandating, which is probably coming, let's be honest. That's where this is headed. And so I guess I'm just being blissfully ignorant and enjoying my burgers and steaks in the interim, because I know that, I'm just too lazy to make that change myself. I think the vegans and the vegetarians are ahead of the curve. Shout out James if you're listening. But and it's probably, that's where it's coming. But I'm just not going to be the first one to hop off the meat and gravy train.
And that's the thing too. You always tell yourself, oh, it's just so hard. I'm used to it. But that really is all it is. It is just a habit. Last summer when I was in Ukraine, I had a really bad bacterial infection, and I was sick for almost 2 weeks. And it was from some bad meat that I had. And I was so put off food, not even just meat, but food in general. But little by little, I knew I had to eat. But I was just like, oh, I'm not touching meat. And for a good month, maybe even 2 months, I was vegetarian, and I understood it's not that hard. It really is just, we're used to meat, so we eat it. But once you don't have it, you can have good, satisfying meals without it. But, I've had a cheeky little bite eventually, and I got back into it. But I think maybe I will try to wean off it again. But I haven't tried human meat yet, and I'm afraid that once I get the taste for it, like nothing else is going to compare.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was kind of one of the character archetypes that I was thinking of potentially in the Japanese band of killers for this adaptation. You could have someone who's kind of staunchly against it and maybe trying to convince the other guys who are like, let's kill our first soldier, Aussie dude, and then he's starving and eventually relents and has a bit of human jerky or whatever, like a bit of the leftovers they've had dry, and then he becomes the biggest cannibal of them all. Like he's like he's got the palate for it, everything alike. He's the Anthony Bourdain of cannibals, and he wants to try everything on the island by the end.
And that, well, here's the thing too, because different sources say that these Japanese soldiers weren't starving. They still had their supply of rations, which means it wasn't out of necessity. They chose to eat human meat, and on multiple occasions. And they weren't only eating POWs. Sources also say they were eating the local natives on the island as well, and that they would refer to Australians as white pig, the meat, and the natives as dark pig or black pig. So again, is this something that just kind of they unspokenly collectively agreed to do? Was it an order from the higher ups? And these are the questions that, unless it's answered in that guy's documentary, I don't think it is though, that there are no answers for this. It just happened enough to become an incident. So it's not just one rare occurrence, but why it happened is an interesting question. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly a confluence of all the different factors, right? Like sometimes they were probably hungry and marooned and, in need of food. Other times they were probably like, well, we're in complete control here. They probably felt extremely arrogant in like the macro sense of the war. They thought they were going to win, and so we're never going to be held accountable here. So why not kill someone ceremonially and then just eat their liver as like a power trip. So that probably happened. These are all things that, like, if I was one of the Australian soldiers there, I'd no doubt be petrified and, find it, especially at that time, because you have to kind of consider that this wasn't that far away from Over the Hill, boys, where everyone was like on a horseback and like war was agreed upon, like we'll meet at the Tower Wall two past midday, and like so, and there was all these kind of like you'd write up the scorecard of the result of the battle afterwards, and like Civil War type of shit where it was kind of like very, very gentlemanly, like good game, lads, and then yeah, exactly. We'll see you on Saturday. And so this was like 50 years after that. So then you find yourself, as you explained, in this incredibly dangerous, frightening place. And then there's, that if you get caught, you're getting tortured, brutally murdered, and then eaten. So that is that would be insane to think about. But I can kind of understand, especially when you understand the cultural context of where the Japanese are coming from, about why they were doing this. And I think a lot of it was probably just kind of like false belief that they wouldn't be held accountable. It's not like if they were going to be, the emperor was going to be in charge of half the world in a couple of years' time, that they were going to be looking over and these things would be considered war crimes. So, yeah, even though it's great fodder for a horror movie in terms of like considering the real story, it's not that much of a jump for me to get to in terms of if I thought I was in control of an entire island and me and my buddies were gonna kill these other guys. I don't think maybe this is an indictment on me, but I think I could look past their humanity pretty quickly and just consider it like sport and eating them for the hell of it as kind of like a power trip. So I think that's what they were doing in some instances, combined with the instances of hunger.
I mean, I'm with you there. I mean, Jesus Christ, this is the country that didn't surrender after a nuclear bomb was dropped on them. And they almost didn't surrender after a second one. What a lot of people don't know is even after the second nuclear bomb, they were still getting firebombed in their major cities. Like, that wasn't the end of the war just yet. And even then, they're like, okay, but if we surrender, it has to be on our terms. And, we'll have our own war crime tribunal. Don't worry, we'll make sure the guys responsible are caught. It's like, no, guys, it has to be unconditional surrender. So even after 2 nuclear bombs, they still weren't sure if they should surrender or not. So this mentality of, I don't even want to say anything goes. It's just, we are on the righteous path. Like, we are almost divine and anyone else is subhuman. And if someone's not human, but me and my buddies are, not only are we entitled to eat this Australian bloke, we should eat this guy. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of me trying to visualize that thought process.
In terms of an adaptation, like, how would you, because you said like a straight up horror movie, and I don't know, it's it's perhaps because just there's Australians involved, and that I just imagine them as kind of like good old country Australians and kind of very provincial and naive, and so immediately I'm extrapolating and seeing the comedy in this story of like these kind of blokes in the middle of nowhere, good soldiers, but perhaps completely out of their depth in terms of what they're willing to do on an ethical level. And so, yeah, I immediately see something akin to like Shaun of the Dead or something where it's like it's like like with a zombie. I don't know but you. Yeah, also in the same breath, you could just make it absolutely terrifying and then humanize the Australians and then turn the Japanese and then I guess the local tribesmen as the kind of monsters. So, what are you thinking in terms of
Thommy,
what would be the best movie?
I can't help myself. Maybe I'm a racist, but I find Australians inherently comical. I mean, fuck me, Australians find Australians comical.
Yeah.
Where like Australian like local news are laughing at some Aussie they're interviewing based on how Australian he is. So I know Aussies find Aussies hilarious. I mean, there could be a version of this movie in which Chris Lilly plays like every character and he plays the cannibal as well.
By the end, he's eating himself. Oh, this is pretty tasty.
And I would love it. I would love it. I mean, I'm all for making the schlocky version of things, and I'm for the comedy version. What I had in my head is almost like the lazy answer, but sometimes the obvious answer is obvious for a reason. And I don't know if you've seen this movie, but it's a cannibal western that came out a couple years ago that just fucking blew my mind. It's one of those things where you go into a movie expecting nothing, and it delivers so hard. And it is with Kurt Russell, and it's called Bone Tomahawk. Have you seen this movie?
Oh no, I've never seen it. It's on my list. Yeah, I've seen the trailer and everything. It looks awesome.
This movie rules so fucking hard. It's one of the few movies in recent memories where the violence actually made me squirm. Because it's not even that, movies desensitize you, but it's the way violence is filmed. You forget that, bodies are a tangible thing, And this movie has a scene that is so disgusting when the cannibals first bisect their first victim. And it is the most horrible thing I've ever seen. And it scared me, which is something movies very rarely do. It's very seldom that a movie genuinely gets under my skin. And this movie, it's not flashy and it's not bloody just for shock value, but it's a very good, almost like rugged, manly Western movie where the antagonists happen to be cannibals. And it's filmed in a very matter-of-fact kind of way. And considering this director's already done that, he's kind of the obvious choice for this movie. His name's Zahler. I'm not sure how you pronounce the last name. And I think he'd be perfect. Just, give him a slightly larger budget and have him basically not remake the movie, but, do it again. Do what you're good at.
So would, I guess, taking the Western model, applying it to this story, would the Australians be the good guys, the quote unquote good guys, the heroes, and then the Japanese would be like, you would tell it from the Australians' perspective?
There's two ways to do this movie, and you kind of hinted at it earlier, which is from the Japanese perspective, which would make maybe even a more interesting movie, because obviously they're not going to paint themselves as the villains. In their mind, they're justified in what they're doing. And I hate when movies over-explain, so I wouldn't want the movie to do that. You would just kind of see them doing it and watch as they evolve and develop a taste for it and see where it goes from there. Another version, which is kind of the one I had in my mind, was, the simple, good old Australian boys out of their element, naive. They're going to fight, the good war, and they end up in fucking Papua New Guinea. Their brothers are off fighting Rommel in North Africa. They're fighting the Germans, and then these poor bastards are in the jungles of New Guinea. And you just see the degradation of these soldiers from, good old boys, patriots, go-getters, to just losing all humanity and hope. And then they're getting eaten too. And I don't know. I mean, I guess the generic ending is a guy makes an escape for it, and it's essentially a slasher movie or a Predator, but with Japanese soldiers.
Yeah. How would if you did that? Like if you do any movie where it doesn't align with the CCP's values, or it has something that could undermine their authority, they create like a Chinese version. There's the infamous there's the infamous Star Wars poster. I think it was the first one of the recent trilogy where the black guy, the British fella, was photoshopped out for the Chinese version. Disney was like, we promote equality, obviously not in China. And but yeah, do you imagine that the Japanese, because they don't want to know exactly what they did, would they have an issue with the representation if you made them to be the ruthless cannibals on a crusade in the Papua New Guinea jungle?
Well, that is an interesting question. I really don't know, because clearly there have been World War II movies made about the Pacific War, and there's Japanese actors in it. But I think, depending on who it is, there might be a line they won't cross. It might be like, look, I understand we were enemies during the war, but you want me to play a fucking cannibal? Like, I don't know. There might be some people who have that issue. Having said that, though, recently on Netflix, it kind of has the vibe of one of those really cheap PBS shows, but it is interesting, and it's about the war tribunal in Tokyo after the war, kind of like the Nuremberg trials for the Germans, but the Japanese version. And it's an English language show, but then I found out it was either fully produced or a co-production by like Japanese state television, and that's something I found interesting. Granted, I don't think any Japanese people have seen this show, but the fact that they produced it and it's, showing them as war criminals means I think they'd be more open to it than what you mentioned with China in this situation and things of that nature. Or granted, Russia would never produce a film that shows them in a negative light at all, especially when it concerns the Second World War. It might be one of those things where, like, hey, if we can make money off of it, we'll produce it, but don't expect anyone in Japan to fucking watch it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess it probably makes sense where China, Russia, for all intents and purposes, they're dictatorships, whereas Japan is not. So you cannot, even if you have like a strong cultural tradition, if you have like more kind of free democratic societies, you can't really control as much of the cultural representation. But what about horror? What about horror stuff in general? Because this is something that I guess with my writing, I sometimes like have elements of horror, or like I try, there's like shocking graphic moments, but I've never been like, I would never classify myself as a horror fan. Are you interested in the horror genre in a meaningful way?
For me, yeah, but I'm not scared. It's more entertainment, or I prefer bad horror movies.
Yeah, me too.
And even the good ones, I like them in the way they're crafted, but they don't scare me. War movies are some of the few things that actually scare me. Did you ever see The Deer Hunter?
The De Niro one from the 70s?
The De Niro one, the famous roulette scene.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Teenager, that scene gave me so much anxiety that no horror movie has ever done. So I think war movies are inherently, if done well, are scary. I mean, I can't stand any type of war movie that's all about bravado and we're fighting for our country and has this sweeping music. I can't be doing with that. Like, to me, that just misses the point. It's offensive. Not even like, oh, it's offensive to the veterans. No, it's offensive to like human sensibilities. Anything that makes war look cool is so shitty and just not something I enjoy. It should be ugly. You should leave the theater not feeling good. If you leave the theater like feeling uplifted, then that's a shitty war movie.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, you just explaining the Deer Hunter, I was automatically thinking of No Country for Old Men, when Javier Bardem is just chasing Josh Brolin like a monster would,
right.
And it has so many of the horror tropes in terms of his appearance and his voice and his kind of like unrelenting pursuit of the hero, and yet you don't automatically think of that as a horror movie in your head. But yeah, I also I kind of like horror movies when I'm stoned, because I can kind of buy into it a little bit more. And like you, I like it when it's bad. If it's a bad horror movie and I'm stoned, it becomes like extra funny. But if it's a good horror movie and I'm stoned, you kind of like, I think I appreciate a good horror movie. It's more crisp in terms of the plot than a lot of kind of like the standard meandering films that I would like, because it kind of has to hit certain beats. And I think that is, from like a writer's perspective, I think that's interesting to look at, where you're like, oh, okay, they're really holding your attention and kind of like keeping you guessing until the end. Things that maybe with more kind of like arty stuff, they take for granted. And but speaking of like funny bad horror movies, you can't look past the granddaddy M. Night Shyamalan, however the fuck you say his name, because he's always good for writing something atrocious. Like, that's another one. When I was a kid, The Sixth Sense, someone ruined it for me in primary school. They're like, Bruce Willis is dead the whole time. And I remember just being blown away, being like, oh, wow. Like, and then I watched the movie, and even though I knew that, I kind of marveled at the at his ability to execute that and not reveal that. And I'm not sure if it holds up, but at the time I was impressed. Since then, hasn't made a good movie, and in fact they're getting progressively worse. And so I saw that his most recent movie, Old. Did you see any of the trailers for that?
Oh yeah, I didn't see it because I felt like the trailers was, I know exactly what this movie is. It's an M. Night Shyamalan movie. It's called Old. The trailer made me laugh though. I thought,
oh dude, it's so bad it's good. It's so bad it's good. And there's this one moment. It's kind of, this is no spoilers. So I watched it when, I think I mentioned to you a few weeks ago when I was coming back down from Toronto, where I'd been up all night drinking and I was still loopy and on a weed gummy in the Toronto airport. It was a shit show. I was in line for 3 hours and I got on the plane finally, and I was still feeling pretty jangly, so I didn't want to just try and sleep. So I just watched, I was like, what's the dumbest, funnest movie I could find? I found Old. The premise is, this family goes to a hotel, kind of like what I just did. They go to an all-inclusive resort on the beach, and then one day with a few of the other hotel guests, they go to a secluded beach. And then when they're on the beach, everyone starts aging rapidly. There's a million holes in the plot. Firstly, these people are aging and they're getting older. Like, so the kids are getting bigger. For some reason, their clothes don't stretch or break. And they also, like, when M. Night Shyamalan gives himself a really cheesy cameo as the bus driver who drops them off at the beach, and he's like, don't forget your food, guys. And he's got this huge like cooler of food. He makes them like, he's one of the English guys, like, this is rather a lot of food. Why do we need this much food? We'll only be here for a few hours. And he's like, oh, just take it. So anyway, they've got this like huge amounts of food, and apparently that's what they're eating when they're aging rapidly. But there is this, it was hilarious but also incredibly disgusting moment at the same time, where there's this little boy in the main family, and then there's this other little girl who's already on the beach, and they're like roughly the same age when it begins. They're like 7 or 8 years old respectively. And so then it cuts to them after like the first few hours where they've become teenagers, and there's this other catastrophe on the beach, like an old woman has keeled over. She's had a heart attack, and so all the adults attending to this old woman, and then these two teenagers who still have the minds of an 8 and 9 year old find themselves in a tent together.
Oh, Jesus.
and you can see where this is going. and it's hilarious on so many different levels, because it's just these like, you know, unknown act. I've never seen them in anything else. And like, this is their big break in a Hollywood film. This is like their big moment. And they're in a tent, and they're saying, oh, I'm just having all these new feelings. And it's just hilarious. It's kind of like when someone's pretending to be intellectually disabled, when they're like, they just want to act in a movie, but they have to pretend to be slow.
Yeah,
but in this
Shyamalan dialogue, he does not know how to write human behavior at all.
And he does not know how to write 8 or 9 year olds with the 17-year-old body. Let me tell you that for free. So anyway, there's all this cheesy dialogue in the temple, like, I'm just having so much more feelings in my body, and my mind is changing. And they're just kind of, they're staring into each other's eyes. And so then it cuts back to they've resolved the woman gets up. She's like, oh, I'm feeling better now. I don't know what happened to me. She's got a blood nose or something. And then one of the parents looks across down the beach and
I know what you're going to say.
The girl who's like has now got like a bump. And they're like holding hands as they're walking down the beach. I was like crying with laughter by myself on the plane, but also kind of like sick to my stomach because I was like, M. Night Shyamalan has kind of, he's like slipped in, he's smuggled child sex into this like movie that was this mass mainstream, very kind of like service level horror film. And so I had a good laugh, but then the hangover started to kick in and I started feeling icky. The fact that I just kind of M. Night had got me privy to some child sex.
Okay.
So that was my most recent experience with a very schlocky bad horror movie. That was so bad it was good.
Forget everything I just said this past hour. M. Night Shyamalan is directing this movie.
Yes.
M. Night Shyamalan is directing this movie. All the Japanese actors are going to speak English. Even if they don't know English, the dialogue is going to be in English. They're just going to memorize the lines phonetically. It's going to be fucking terrible. And there's going to be a twist. But I can't think of a twist worthy of Shyamalan just yet. If I do at the end of the podcast, I'll scream it out. But yeah, just make this movie an absolute disaster.
Well, yeah. Well, that I don't know. That was the weird thing about that old movie where I was watching, and it was incredibly formulaic, every single beat in it. But then I was curious. I was like, what's going to be the main twist at the end? And so I wikied the movie after I got a couple of days later. And the twist it's so shit. It's like
let's hear it. I'm never gonna. Oh, I might see it depending on what the twist is, but let's hear it.
That's the thing is that it isn't really a twist. It's like because when the kids first get to the hotel, what the little girl in the main family befriends, or maybe it's the little boy, the guy who impregnates another 9-year-old. The father, the young father, meets like this little kid on who's like one of the hotel managers, like one of the locals' kids, and he gives him like this little riddle about like a poem, and then he realizes like later in the movie what he's actually, because they're trying to get off this beach, and every time they try and walk back through the jungle, they get a nosebleed and then get sucked back onto this beach. And then he realizes, okay, that's we need to swim back over the coral reef to the main hotel. That's how we'll survive. So him and his sister do that, and then they revealed that it was actually they were testing these like rapidly aging drugs on and so I was like, well, that's not really a twist. That's just kind of explaining what just happened. It's like the laziest thing ever.
It just explains why the movie sucks, but just because the movie explains it doesn't make it good.
yeah, because you watch that movie and you go, okay, this seems like some weird psychological experiment they're playing on these people. Every piece of evidence is pointing towards that. And then you imagine at the end they're going to say, oh, no, it wasn't a psychological experiment. It was something else. It was something mystical, or maybe they were just in a dream. There would be some other explanation. But instead, M. Night just said, no, it was a psychological experiment. You got it, by a drug company testing out drugs. So it's like, that made it even more frustrating to me. I was like, he's been phoning it in for years, but now he doesn't even have a twist up his sleeve.
Is he trying to do a cheeky little commentary about the ethics of big pharmaceutical companies doing like testing on animals or unsuspecting test victims? Or is it not even that shallow? Is it Perhaps. So stupid? Like it's not even that.
I read that it was also based on this short story by a French writer. And I think that in that short story, they left it ambiguous in terms of why they were aging so rapidly on the beach. probably in kind of the tradition of French existentialism of like, well, who knows what's happening and all that stuff. Leave it up to your own interpretation. But so M. Night, he didn't even come up with the main story, and he tacked on a shitty, not even a real twist to the end of it. So pretty poor effort, but a hilarious watch if you're in the right frame of mind.
Look, I'll say this for M. Night. He gave us Mark Wahlberg's best performance. Have you seen The Happening?
I never saw that one. Is that the water aliens one? No, that's Mel Gibson. That's Signs. Yeah.
That's the Mel Gibson one. Which, by the way, Mel Gibson is the best cry actor I've ever seen. Like, I don't know how he does it, but
doesn't he angry cry?
He angry cries, and he also eats and cries at the same time, which I've heard are the two hardest things for actors to do, and he combines them.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Why did he lose the accent? When did that happen? Sorry.
No, he's got an American. I think he's one where it's like he's got an American dad. So, yeah, it's not like, yeah. So I think he was already kind of like an American from a young age. So I'll give him a pass. I like. He's got some good. He's made some good movies, Mel.
He has, and crazy psycho. He's a psychopath, but goddamn, he's made some good movies. Gallipoli, which you mentioned earlier. He was still an Aussie back when he did that movie. That's a heartbreaking movie.
How fast you gonna run? Fast.
Yeah. Was that like a junior high or high school movie you guys had to watch?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we watched that one. The symbolism of the last shot. Yeah. We got that one rammed down our throats, and actually not a bad movie. I'm not sure how it holds up, but yeah, kind of did a pretty good job explaining the horror of that particular campaign.
I mean, to me, that's as anti-war as an anti-war movie can get, because not Mel Gibson, the other guy who's kind of the go-getter, the enthusiast.
Yeah, the fast guy, yeah.
There's no real war scene in the movie, and the final shot is him running into no man's land, and he gets shot. Yeah. The movie just fucking ends.
Yeah. But tell me about the Wahlberg, the M. Night, Marky Mark.
There's people who do good Wahlberg impressions. I'm not one of them, but if you just go on YouTube and look up a compilation of his acting in that movie, and the dialogue written by M. Night plus his acting, it's amazing. He plays a science teacher, which is already, just not believable. And there's a scene where, because everyone's paranoid, everyone's dying, and this old woman's like, "Are you here to fucking rob me?" He's like, "What? No." And the way he goes, like, tries to convince her he's not going to rob her is the most stupid thing I've ever seen. I cannot do it justice. I just implore everyone to watch it. But before I forget, on the topic of horror movies and this movie, I think a horror movie's music is such a big part of how effective a horror movie is. And I feel like it's kind of a lost art that so many horror movies just have the most generic soundtracks nowadays, because I think back to movies like The Shining or the original Halloween or The Exorcist, and those songs are iconic in those movies. And I was thinking, are there any horror movie soundtracks that stick out to you and that just really take a movie that's already good but really elevates it?
Yeah, so I'm probably not enough of an aficionado of the genre where, yeah, I concur 100% where if the soundtrack sound landscape aligns with the imagery, it takes it to the next level. But I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, no. How about yourself?
Well, there's the one recent movie, and when I say recent, I guess I mean the past decade, that really got under my skin, and there's no pun intended, is a movie called Under the Skin. Have you seen this one?
No, is that Joseph Gordon-Levitt or no, that's Mysterious Skin, $5 game. That was from like 20 years ago. Under the Skin.
It's Scarlett Johansson, and she's alien. That you don't know it's an alien, you just think it's a hot Scarlett Johansson who lures men back to her place. And on paper, the plot is pretty thin. It's all about the atmosphere and the music. Because the music actually sounds like it was composed by an alien. It's so eerie and weird that I was thinking with this movie about the cannibals, you couldn't have any type of generic music. It would have to be something like really experimental and really out there to emphasize just how weird this entire situation is. So no generic like horns blazing World War II music, trumpets, nothing triumphant sounding or anything like that.
Maybe Grimes, Elon Musk's ex. She's if there's anyone an alien walking the earth, I think she'd be pretty close on the list. And she kind of actually would be a good fit because she's kind of directly influenced by a lot of the Japanese anime characters and kind of culture. So she could kind of add some Japanese things in here or there.
Is Grimes her real name?
No, it's Claire. Claire Boucher.
Yeah, that sucks. Yeah. Grimes is better.
Stick with Grimes.
Stick with Grimes.
But just to take, before we wrap up, just to take a step back to like Wahlberg for a second, it amazes me where everyone has bodies in their backyard in terms of things they've done artistically that they're not proud of. And it's always amazes me when you can be an A-list actor or musician or director, and yet you've got some atrocious work in the past. I think the only ones who don't have atrocious work are the complete auteurs. People like Tarantino, I guess that's arguable. Some people have seen like some of Tarantino's first films or something before he got a proper budget and connected with good cinematographers and all that. But like people who really take their time and they produce a lot less work. But anyone who's kind of like a working writer, actor, director, they tend to, even the really good ones, only have like a hit ratio of 80%. And out of the 20%, like 5% are bombs, atrocious stuff. And so it always amazes me where like sometimes people can have like a really bad bomb and it derails their entire career. Whereas the Wahlbergs of the world, they can kind of like have that stuff, but he's still considered an A-list actor and will get cast in action movies, dramas, and comedies to this day. And I'm assuming he's still one of the highest paid. So I think there's probably, it depends how well connected you would be on it from a business perspective. Clearly, like if you're the producer, surprise, surprise, I keep casting myself as the A-list actor. Like, so I reckon there would be like, those are the most business savvy, can kind of preserve their kind of record. But I don't know, taking this on a personal level, as I kind of create more stuff and the older I get, the more embarrassed I am of like the bodies in my own backyard of things that I've done in the past where I've done nothing artistically thus far. And so no one cares as much as me, but I'm finding I care more and more about things that I've done in the past that don't kind of reflect where I am now. And I kind of wish they didn't exist. Even if, not because I'm afraid of being like people going back and finding and exposing my bad art. It's more just like it bugs me on a personal level where I'm like, I feel like I'm better now, or what I was doing then was pandering or just not honest or something. And so, yeah, I guess I'm looking for some solidarity here. Do you feel the same thing?
And I think that's a sign of self-criticism and self-evaluation that a lot of people don't have. And even if you're the only one who thinks it and everyone else is telling you, no, it was good, the fact that you're able to look at it and think, that was horseshit, I can do better, I think that's a healthy thing to a point, because I'm right there with you. I look at the earliest shit I've ever written and I cringe. I'm so embarrassed. I think it's shit. And I noticed, though, when I was younger, I would try to like write things purposely to seem profound. But the more I did that, the more I realized it was just absolute shite. Like when you try to make something profound, Same with when you try to make something funny, it almost never is. Something either is or it isn't, regardless of your intent to make it so. So now I write kind of with no intent. I just write what I want to see. And if something is funny incidentally, then great. But it's not like now I'm writing the funny scene, or now I'm writing like the big emotional part. And as a younger writer, I was very guilty of that. And it makes me sick to my stomach looking at it now. It's so embarrassing.
Yeah, it's tough because I don't know, you're trying to get out of your own way and just be yourself on the page or on the mic or wherever. But then I think about, like, I don't know, if I was going to visit you and we were going to have a couple beers and play some video games, watch a movie or something, I'd bring like a certain level of energy where it's like, oh, David's been good enough to invite me into his home. I'm not just going to be like flat 5 out of 10. I'm going to bring something, because I'm going to be like, yeah, I'm going to bring a 6-pack of beers, and I'm going to like maybe bring some funny anecdotes of the things that have happened. I'm going to be like me, but elevated slightly. And so that's another thing that I've found interesting, where it's like you listen to a podcast and you listen to like another podcast to be funny, and you're like, oh, that kind of reminds me of me a little bit. So you want to be like, how do I tap into my own energy when I am similar to that funny quip, or like, but then you're also like, but don't copy that guy. Don't be him, because even if other people can't tell that I'm copying him or trying to like replicate his essence, I will know that myself as well. So there's a weird minefield that happens where you're like, just get out of your own way, try and be yourself. But then you're also like, I have to live with my 5 out of 10 self the whole time. I'm bored of him. The rest of the world will get bored of him pretty soon. So I need to bring an elevated sense of myself to everything I do, but I don't want it to be too much, because that will be overbearing and fake.
So what you're asking is, how does Mark Wahlberg live with himself? Like,
yes,
consistently mediocre. I mean, whose favorite actor is Mark Wahlberg?
It's a good question.
I don't think anyone out there. I mean, you have like your Liam Neeson types and your Bruce Willises, who's like, those are the movies everyone's dad watches. They're all the same. They're interchangeable, but dads love that shit. And then you have like your DiCaprios, who, even if it's not your favorite movie, you know that if he gets involved and he's making a movie with Martin Scorsese, it's going to be worth it at the least. There's going to be a little bit more to it than the average movie. Then you get Mark Wahlberg, who just is consistently working, but why? Who is this for? But they're always making money. Who the fuck is watching this?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's sometimes he does well playing off himself, like in the Departed. He was pretty good. Because he's kind of like, even maybe not directly, he's making fun of his stereotype a little bit there.
Do you think he's smart enough to know that, though?
Yeah, 100%.
Scorsese knows that, and you think so? You think he's aware?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because he's a pretty savvy business guy. Like, I think he's kind of aware of his cultural. Whereas I think you'd maybe put someone like Mickey Rourke, and Mickey Rourke, I think unaware of who, and he's kind of like over the hill now, and yeah, just like, I think he's still making movies. I saw one on the plane where it was just some B-grade action movie, so kind of like The Commando or something, with him and some other dude. And but yeah, like, I think that's a perfect example where Mickey Rourke, even when he was like, I never saw it, but he was in that Iron Man movie, but he was clearly in there to be like, okay, we'll put you as a foil for Robert Downey Jr. So children of the 80s can be like, oh, two 80s actors kind of like having a sentimental moment from, cinema history or whatever. Whereas Mickey Rourke, you can kind of was like, all right, here we go. I'm back. Kind of like the whole mind fuck that Michael Keaton's character goes through in Birdman, where half the time he's like, no, I've got to do something more artistic and true to myself and like make a mark on the world. And then other times he's like, no, let's do it. Birdman 8. Watch the skies burn. Like he's kind of gets high on his own But yeah, I would definitely put Wahlberg in the self-aware camp. And but yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's just a crazy religious nut with an insane work ethic. But maybe there's a role for him in this movie as well. M. Night can direct, and then like the twist at the end is that Wahlberg is just the one guy who can save the entire island himself. Oh yeah, because there's that amazing Wahlberg tweet. Not a tweet. I think it was in an interview where he was saying that if he was on the plane that crashed into the Twin Towers, that wouldn't have gone down. Not on my plane.
This is the movie we're making. I don't know if the podcast allows for this, but like alternate history scenarios, like what if Mark Wahlberg was on the plane and then bam, holy shit.
Yeah, that's definitely we're gonna have a 9/11 episode coming up. But
I watched terrorists. Right. No, I'm from Boston. This isn't going to you guys.
Oh, you said you couldn't do an impression. That's at least an 8 out of 10. Mark,
it's at least an 8 out of 10. I could go on about Mark Wahlberg, but maybe we'll save it for the next one.
Yeah, we might have to start a sub podcast, the Marky Mark Show. All right, I'll hit record here, and then we'll talk about the next one.
All right, cheers, Thommy.